I'm so happy to be introducing this topic. This is based in part on a special series of essays that we've commissioned on this topic. And I'm here really just to introduce our two main speakers, Nathan Lents and of course, Joan Roughgarden. So welcome, both of you. And I'm going to pass to Nathan, basically. You're going to be the main narrator here, and I'm going to become a member of the audience, and I'll come in along with the rest of you for Q&A. So Nathan, would you like to introduce this session?
Sure. Well, it's my honor to introduce all of you to Joan Roughgarden in case you haven't had the pleasure of meeting her or hearing her speak yet. We're going to talk today about a topic that's near and dear to my heart as well as to Joan's, and that's sexual and gender diversity in the animal world and how it evolves, where it comes from, what it does for species, and how we, I hope we'll get to this, how we as scientists approach it and understand it and talk about it, the words we use to describe it. So. Since the title of this podcast is Revisiting Evolution's Rainbow, I'd like to start by revisiting Evolution's Rainbow. So, Joan, can you take us back to 2004? California University Press is about to publish the book. If someone came up to you then in 2004 and asked you, what is the main message of this book? How would you have answered at that time?
Well, at that time, and even to some extent now, the task is to acquaint people with the diversity of gender and sexuality in the natural world. And in doing so, to speak to the question of whether or not gender and sexually variant people are unnatural. And and so if you see precedents to the diversity that our species exhibits and other species as well, it's manifestly natural. Of course, the other complaint always thrown against LGBT people is that it's sinful. So unnatural and sinful are the two things we always have to deal with. And then the sinful thing is a separate issue. And I've also written to some extent and with theologians about that in the context of the Christian Bible. So that's why I wrote the book. And I think I may have mentioned that I originally thought it was just going to be a pamphlet because most of us, at that time were aware of a few anecdotes of species like fish that change sex and so forth. And I thought that there might be a dozen or so of these, and I put this together as a little pamphlet. And as I got into it, it really expanded. And so the evolution's rainbow itself, as you know, has three main parts to it. The first and the best known part is about the gender diversity and sexuality and so forth in the animal kingdom. Then the middle part is about the the developmental biology and genetics of gender and sexuality in humans. And the third part, which I think in some senses as important as the first part, because the middle part is just kind of technical, it's kind of boring. But the third part is about comparative gender and sexuality in different cultures. And since I'm not an anthropologist, I was sort of off the reservation doing this, but that I think adds a whole lot of insight into the properties of our species with respect to gender and sexuality. So I think the third part is equally important, and there were at that time, and I don't even know about now, efforts to produce syntheses of gender and sexuality diversity from a cultural and historical point of view. Anthropologists seems to keep it at arm's length, whereas evolutionary biologists are beginning to engage the diversity seriously now.
Yeah, well, believe me, I want to get back to the reception from evolutionary biologists in a minute. But I first want to make sure we cover a little bit about what brought you to 2004. And for those that don't know, Joan Roughgarden was a very accomplished field biologist, and you studied lizards, whiptail lizards, among other things. And so, how does a lifetime of studying whiptail lizards culminate in writing a book like this? Tell us about your personal experiences as a professional biologist and the insights that those provided.
Well, first, so just a small point. They aren't whiptail lizards. They are anolis lizards. They're,
Anolis, okay.
they're different. And well, anyone doing field biology just encounters a lot of diversity. And it's something that you don't really get much exposure to in a typical undergraduate education. But I remember when I was a grad student in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, and they had a nice program there of what they would, I think, term natural history seminars, where various systematists and uh, biologists, animal-based systematics and taxonomy-based people would go to different places, and then they were really good at finding diversity. So when you really are talking to a herpetologist as opposed to an ecologist, a herpetologist really has a sixth sense for how to find lizards and snakes and all sorts of things in the bush. And so, at any rate, these people would do this in whatever group they were working on. They'd come back and they'd show slides of all the species of grasshoppers, or all the species of cockroaches, or all the species of birds. And it's just mind-boggling once you start seeing how much diversity is actually out there. And yes, if you then study the individual species, each one has its own story to tell, and each one has its own pattern of gender and sexuality and mating systems and so forth. And that's what prepared me for Evolution's Rainbow, is just trying to case out what kind of diversity is there in our species. And I knew that it wasn't being, taught, and diversity tends not to be taught anyway, but it certainly wasn't being taught with respect to humans. And so that was what led to Evolution's Rainbow.
Well, and I want to talk about the reception from the community of biologists to your book. But first, I want to share my own reaction when I first read the book, because I don't know if it was Huxley, but one of Darwin's contemporaries, after they first read On the Origin of Species, were like, "Ah, this is so obvious. How did I not think of this?" That was the reaction. And that was kind of the reaction I had to your book as well. And let me explain what I mean. So, as someone who went to school a little bit more recently than you did, diversity was taught in a lot of ways as the theme of biology. That was one of Darwin's key insights, right? Was that nature has this way of producing diversity every generation, and then sex exists purely to recombine that diversity and come up with variability and variation, and then let nature select the good combinations of that diversity and so forth. So it seems like biologists had a good understanding of the role of diversity in natural selection, but not when it came to sex. It seemed like sex itself was only appreciated for how it spreads other kinds of diversity, but diversity of sex didn't seem to be part of the teaching around diversity. I remember, there was a male form and a female form in every species, and everything kind of conforms to one of those two. Everything's trying to compete to be the best male or the best female. And so the appreciation of diversity really wasn't included when talking about sexual reproduction. So let me ask, how did your fellow evolutionary biologists react when you shone this light of diversity on sex itself?
Well, there's several things. I think the book, to some extent, caught people by surprise, and um, and there, as I say, there's several things. First of all, at that time, the reality of diversity in gender and sexuality wasn't appreciated. I remember, I think I have quotations in the book about, I remember the book's 20 years old now. And I remember quoting someone, an ichthyologist, I believe, saying that 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 homosexual relations were very rare. And that was about the time that Bruce Badgermeal's book came out. And at that time, I had done a lot of research and had a whole slew of examples of natural same-sex sexuality in animals. And then his book sort of doubled the number examples that I had almost overnight. And so at that time, 20 years ago, we didn't have an appreciation of how widespread gender or sexuality variation is, and to a lesser extent, gender. But then and people were, I'm not sure anyone was all that against my pointing that out. But where people did get bent out of shape is that I started criticizing um, uh, the theoretical structure, the conceptual structure being used to explain sexual reproductive behavior. And as you know, a lot of that traces to Darwin's theory of sexual selection. And I looked into it at some length and basically concluded that you couldn't fix it up. And that's what people are really pissed off about, is my saying that sexual selection theory is just on the wrong track to begin with. And so we really need to start from scratch. And they're still mad about that. And so I'm still off the reservation, to use that phrase again, when it comes to that. And so my most recent research for the last 6-7 years has been on technical issues. And so I'm doing mathematical modeling of virus and bacteria and the relationship of the holobiome to the host of the holobiome. So it's comfortably technical, comfortably mathematical, not so controversial. and it's been nice to get away from having so many people so mad at me. But on the other hand, I really do think that sexual selection theory and the extended sexual selection theory really is incorrect. And I've just done a paper. I finally, got to writing a big review article on this, which is in a journal called Biological or Sex Differences, the Biology of Sex Differences. And I didn't think they were going to publish it, and because it's about 40 pages, a great big thing, and it's a deep dive, point by point, where sexual selection is incorrect and where an alternative that I've been suggesting is arguably better. And so it is. They have accepted it, subject to some very minor revisions. So later this month, I'll be sending that back in. So people really are in denial about how problematic sexual selection theory is, and how at point after point it's either doesn't fit the facts or is directly contradicted by population genetic theory. So one of these days, people will stop attacking me on an ad hominem basis for this, and they'll start actually engaging what the problems are. And then they may or may not decide to side with me on social selection versus sexual selection, but at least we'll start to get some recognition of the depth of the problems to sexual selection theory.
I didn't mean to break in here, but I'm just wondering, Joan, if you could offer a little bit more detail, just so that some of us, not everyone here, I think, is really familiar with this. And of course, you're making a very strong and general claim. And so I just wonder if you could give us a little bit more of a tutorial on this, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask too, Joan. For those who don't know about your critique of sexual selection, could you summarize, maybe not 40 pages, but just summarize some of your critiques?
Oh, bummer. I want the 40 pages.
You got it next month.
Well, so kind of in a nutshell, Darwin wrote about the peacock. He usually starts with the peacock, and he talks about females choosing males, and that this explains the reason for male peacocks being having such a large, colorful tail, and the peahen being relatively plain by comparison. And then he escalates that into a theory of sex roles and uses phrases like males are passionate, females are coy, with rare exceptions. And so he's actually enunciating this as a general theory of sex roles in the animal kingdom. And now there are a lot of corollaries to that. One is that, so the question is, what are females selecting for? And that then led to the supposition that they were selecting for males that had good genes. And that then led to the issue of, well, do males have good genes? Is there a hierarchy of male genetic quality for females to bother selecting for? And this goes on and on. And then the whole sexual selection nugget right there expands backwards into a theory of why there is sexual reproduction at all, why when there is sexual reproduction, the gametes are packaged either into males or females or hermaphrodites, and then going forward from that nugget, is there sexual conflict necessary between males and females? Are males and females competing with each other, or are they in it together to raise offspring? And so there's this large system of hypotheses that I call the sexual selection system. And it begins with Darwin's original characterization of male and female sex roles. And point by point along this entire array of issues, there's a lot of question. So does the sexual selection account at the beginning for why there's sex at all? The sexual selectionists tend to think that that sexual reproduction removes bad genes from the gene pool. And the alternative is that sexual reproduction leads to a diverse genetic portfolio, similar to a stock market maintaining a portfolio where you'd maintain a lot of variety, and that works best in a fluctuating environment. And then why is there male and female packaged? Why are the gametes packaged into individuals the way they are, and so forth? So, and this, just to mention the genetic quality thing, there's really no evidence that there is a hierarchy of genetic quality in males for females to select, and it leads to a very important problem with sexual selection theory, which is called the paradox of the Lek. Now, if hypothetically there were a hierarchy of quality and genetic quality in males, and then if generation after generation females select against the males with bad genes and select for the males with good genes, well, then lo and behold, after about 20 generations of that, you've eliminated all the bad genes, and all you're left with are the males with good genes. And so in order to justify continual selection and going forward from that, you have to postulate some process that regenerates bad genes for the females to continue to select against. You say, oh my God, and so that's what requires then sexual selection to come up with very ad hoc theories for that. And then another important point has to do with selecting males for good or bad genes. Now, sexual selectionists talk, for example, about the accumulation of deleterious mutations. And yes, there is an accumulation of deleterious mutations in population genetics, but you can calculate what the expected number of deleterious genes we all carry. And then that's a Poisson distribution. It's Poisson distributed. And so you can calculate what an individual with good genes would have versus what an individual who's unlucky enough to have more bad genes based on a Poisson distribution. Well, this turns out to be about 10% or something like that. So the scope between a good gene and a bad gene, a male, is minuscule. You could never detect it in the field. So the problem after problem, with sexual selection narratives. And so I've packaged together the alternatives to these at each step as the so-called social selection theory. And it differs from the sexual selection theory in not focusing so much on competition and good genes and so forth, but it focuses more on cooperation and in bargaining and deal making and that sort of thing. So as I say, it's a big subject area, and it's hard to boil it down.
You've done a beautiful job of boiling it down, my friend. So just to let you know.
Oh, thank you. But it hopefully this review arc I've written will help.
Yeah, and I imagine what you're writing is more technical and more aimed right at the heart of the theory. But it seems to me that a lot of it is relatively more easily simplified by what I would call, or what others have called, optimization, where the idea that underlying sexual selection and many of those, even some of the bases of natural selection, is that there's an optimal way, even momentarily an optimal way, an optimal form, an optimal behavior, an optimal morphology. But what I think your work really talks about is that there isn't one optimal way to be. And in fact, a lot of times, especially in social, and we're talking about social animals, I think, more than anything, but we see this even in animals that are not social. You see that the variety sometimes is the point, and variety is specifically maintained because, as you mentioned, it does not take very many rounds of selection to wean a population down to a fairly narrow morphology or whatever. So the fact that we don't see that in nature, we don't see populations of identical individuals, tells us a little bit that diversity is maintained by one mechanism or another. Am I understanding that right? I mean, how would you expand on my point about why we see so much diversity if optimization is the goal of selection?
Well, you're right. Optimization is a very powerful tool, but you usually use it for a single trait, like the optimal shape of a wing or the optimal shape of a fish's fin in a given media, and and the optimal sort of retinal characteristics of a fish's eye, depending on how deep the water is, and then the optimal pigments in the algae, depending on the light, and all this sort of stuff. So these are not social traits. And so one of the big issues that we're dealing with now is, as you know, has to do with the definition of sex and gender. And in Evolution's Rainbow, I originally suggested that we should continue to use the definition that botanists and zoologists have for many, many decades, which to define sex on the basis of gamete size. And so males are makers of small gametes and females makers of large gametes, and hermaphrodites makers of both. And suggested that we could widen the topic of gender, to include everything else. And so as a soundbite, what I like to say is sex is gametes, everything else is gender, which is a widening of the social science use of the word gender, and extends it to animals. Because in my view, it's qualitatively the same if a trait is constructed evolutionarily or hormonally or socially. These are all just different mechanisms of generating a trait, which itself then has the significance of helping the carrier of that trait deliver offspring to the next generation. So even 20 years ago, I was saying that, and that still is an issue now, as to how one defines sex and gender, whether people are comfortable widening gender to include animals, and conversely, whether or not people think that defining a sex binary on the basis of gamete size is too restrictive, and that the common usage of the word sex uses more adjectives than just gamete size. So that I think will be thrashed out in the future, and of course, you know how I feel on that. So in the case of getting back to your question about the diversity, the diversity in the social situation seems to involve different roles. And so one of the cases that keeps coming up are these roughs, which are a ground nesting shorebird. And they have multiple male morphs. And there are a lot of fish with multiple male morphs and so forth. And Fausto Sterling has for a long time said that therefore there are 4 sexes. And back when I was writing Evolution's Rainbow, I said, well, there are 4 genders of roughs and multiple genders of fish. And because I'm adhering to the distinction that the sex is determined by the size of the gamete. So there are four types of males. They're males because they all make sperm, but on the other hand, they're completely different types of individuals. Their entire phenotype is different. Their life history is different, and yet they serve social roles. They interact, and so the large male will hold the territory. The small male will flock with the female birds, and get to know them. And then when the female birds, and then he leaves them, goes and joins and is courted to join a territory by the large male. And then when the females come, what I said is that this cooperator male basically can act like a marriage broker and help introduce the females to the male who's been sitting there defending a territory for all this time. So you get these different, but the general point is that you get these different morphs and types of social social types. The diversity in the social types maps onto different social roles. And the other thing we have to remember is that the animals talk with their colors. What you see the animal, it's its body English, literally. That's how they speak to one another, is by what uniform they wear and how they change color. And even when they're interacting with one another, they can get red, or they can, and we can do that too. If we get embarrassed, we get red, and these animals all do that. And so I see the diversity within social characteristics with social traits as indicating diversity of social function.
Right. And I think Darwin even talked about blushing, right? And what
Yeah.
the communicative value of sort of revealing sometimes emotional states against your will, and how selection might operate on that. And I think a little bit you're getting into some mechanisms of selection. I'm thinking of frequency dependent selection, for example, that sometimes in a social environment and with a social trait specifically, just the mere fact of not going with the crowd sometimes offers an advantage unto itself because there's an opening. And I don't know how much you want to talk about mechanism, but if that can play out in the sex and gender diversity, it would partially explain why it's maintained, why optimization theory doesn't really work when it comes to sexual diversity. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I think that what this leads me to, or let me tell you where I'm going, is it seems like there's been a lot of overlooking of some of this diversity. And you tell some examples in your book, but can you give us a fine point of an example of how the scientific community, missed some of this diversity because they were so focused on optimization?
Oh, I'm not sure I would agree with that analysis exactly. I mean, optimization as I said, is used for single traits, for non-social traits. Now, the counterpart of optimization theory for multiple parties is called game theory, and that's been used now for about 20 years. And game theory does allow for polymorphisms of different players and equilibria, which involve multiple parties. And so someone who was who was thinking in optimization terms, or had a kind of optimization style to their thought, would just migrate from optimization theory to game theory when it came to social traits. So I wouldn't blame the indifference or almost obstinance, you might say, of biologists towards sexual diversity on optimization theory, because I think that it is to some extent covered by game theory, and certainly could be. I mean, if people were interested in more game theoretic treatments of social systems, it'd be great to see a game theoretic model offered for the roughs or for the bluegill sunfish that change that have multiple genders and so forth, and to work out what the optimal ratios would be, or what
And don't they exist, John? I'd be surprised if they didn't exist for something well studied such as the bluegill sunfish.
I'm not sure if yeah, they might. They might, David. I just can't think of it offhand.
All right.
And again, it wouldn't be an optimal. It would be like an equilibrium mix of the different players. And you also find that even in salmon. I'm, I'm not sure I've seen a game theoretic treatment of the salmon jack versus the two types of males in the salmon.
Yeah, the
The
hook
one with
nose
the big
and
hook
the
nose,
yeah.
and then the other one, and what the steady state ratio would be between them. Maybe, David, but I haven't. It doesn't come to mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we want to move into questions from our audience in a moment here. I want to ask one question. I had one more question I was dying to ask. So, in the 21 years since the book has come out, either based on reactions or based on more things that you've learned or the field has learned, what would you do differently, or how would you write the book differently if you were starting from scratch writing Evolution's Rainbow today? What would be what have we learned since then, or what have you learned since then? That would make it into the book?
Well, apart from updated examples and more examples, I mean, there were a lot of decisions to make at the beginning. And one was to write the information as a book, which, as you know, the supply and demand situation with respect to book editors is different than that with a journal. So a lot of my ideas are definitely not publishable in animal behavior literature. They would be really shot down right away. On the other hand, you have book editors who are definitely looking for books that will sell, and so the kind of peer review that they have is more oriented to the public than and to potential readership and to interest than it is to protecting anybody's turf. Whereas the peer review in journals is usually all about protecting turf. And although I must say, when you get into technical stuff like the virus and bacteria modeling I'm doing now, the peer review is really helpful. And so it's not peer review in general. It's just that peer review, particularly on issues as contentious as something like sexual reproduction, is really going to be oriented to defending the turf of the people who have been using sexual selection theory, and they're not about to give that up. And it's asking a lot for someone to do that, and to say, oh, okay, well, yeah, I really got this wrong all these years. So that's a big issue, is sort of end running the peer review establishment when writing Evolution's Rainbow. And so people kept saying to me, well, you could have been maybe more conciliatory. And well, how do you, if you actually do think that sexual selection theory is dead wrong and it's on the wrong track, how do you say that nicely? And so you can try, but it does come down to the fact that you're in flat out opposition. And so so I wouldn't do that differently, even though I appreciate that the advice of people who say that it would have been nice to provide a way out for people who were sexual selection advocates so that they didn't get so bent out of shape over it, over the criticism. But uh, but I still think the framework that I introduced would be a very useful still would be a very useful framework of starting with sex and then going to gender and then going to gender roles and progressing through this sequence of issues. I think it organizes the field really well. And so we'll see. I'm surprised that there's so much interest in it now. I thought that things had pretty much died down, but I suppose we have to thank, if I can use that phrase, the Republicans and Donald Trump for reinvigorating the interest in this subject area.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all agree that the definitions of sex and gender aren't really going to be resolved by presidential executive orders. I think that these are biological concepts and sociological concepts. If there are experts on these topics, they're found not in the White House. So I do want to open now to questions from the audience. So if you're comfortable speaking, you don't have to turn on your camera. Maybe just use the raise hand function, which will start automatically. If you notice, boom, did it for me. If you leave your hand up, it'll start. So if you have a specific question, just raise your hand if you're comfortable. Otherwise, you can type it into the chat and just be sure that it's detailed enough that we know exactly what, because there's a couple questions in there, but I think they were to conversations that we've moved on from. So while we're waiting for some audience Q&A, let me just ask one more question that's specific to the content of Evolution's Rainbow. One particular area where you critiqued, I think, very well and very pointed criticism was in the concept of female mimicry, at least in some of the examples that you raised. So how has the reaction been to your critique? Because I think that I agreed with you almost immediately that some of the examples of so-called female mimicry really strain credulity in terms of, do we really think the animals are duped, by these variations? So has any thinking changed? Did you have any impact on other people's view about female mimicry, at least in those examples?
No, not that I know of. I find that the animal behavior community is really impervious to critiques, and it's also the evolutionary psychologists. I mean, the evolutionary psychologists have been criticized at great length, and they don't listen. They just keep doing it, and so one of these days, we're really the field will be healthy if we can start having maybe even some public debates or public panel discussions or something like that, in which we start to engage these issues. But the language continues, the pejorative language in the primary literature. So, and just the other day, I saw the phrase turn up in a paper about the so-called sneaky fuckers, and one of the male morphs was called a sneaky fucker. And so, yeah, you can't believe that something like that is being used by professional biologists often in classrooms. And that whenever they use the phrase, everyone snickers, and so you don't begin to get an understanding of what the social role is of the different male morphs and so on, and especially if one of them is declared to be a sneaky fucker, and that's probably not what it's doing. And because, as I also pointed out, almost all the time that these matings occur, the other male is looking on. I mean, and
Yeah, could you give me an example of a sneaker that you don't think is being described correctly?
well, I mean, the issue involves I forget what the phrase is. It's something like where the male in charge allots a certain amount of mating opportunity to a subordinate male in order to get the cooperation and help of the subordinate male. And this was documented very well, I think, in some fish, some Mediterranean fish, in which the cooperator male was helping to tend the nest. And then in the case of the roughs, the cooperator male was facilitating the mating of the territory holding male, so making a trio. And there are other Australian birds where this happens, and it's reproductive. I forget what the phrase is, but it involves the cooperator male using opportunity to mate as a currency with which to pay for help from the subordinate males, from the cooperator males. And this seems to be a pretty general tactic, and it's so that's the kind of case I would have in mind.
Okay. So do we have any audience members willing to offer a question on a different area? Or, I mean, I can keep talking and asking.
It was called reproductive incentives. It was something
Incentives.
like
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I saw there were a couple questions here in the chat, but I don't know if they want to, the conversation's moved on, or would you like to?
I have a question.
Oh, here we go. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Hey, John. This is Patty Brennan. It's always fun to hear you speak on these topics. And I do have a question because you, this distinction that you want to make between sex and gender, and basically saying sex is the gametes, right? And this is what we have always termed kind of like the biological definition of sex. Males make small, numerous motile gametes. Females make large and few, and typically in motile gametes. I think that even there, the diversity of what we find in gametic biology is really very underappreciated, right? And there are many exceptions to this rule, right? So there are many species, for example, where the males make very large gametes. There is a species of Drosophila where males make 5 millimeter long sperm, and they make 5 of them, right? So they make fewer sperm than females make eggs. And there are some species of butterflies where males make different types of sperm altogether, right? Some that can fertilize and others that cannot fertilize. And so we have still chosen to call those individuals males and females, but still it requires a lot of rule bending from given our own criteria for how we had decided originally to classify this as sex. So I don't know if you have thought about this or if you have any ideas about this. What do we do with that gametic diversity? Because it's not quite as simple as, small gametes means male and large gametes is female.
Yeah. Hi, Pat. Good to hear from you. So in Evolution's Rainbow, for what it's worth, I did mention a bunch of cases of that. I mentioned the Drosophila case, and of course, when you get to algae and fungi, then you may not have two sizes of gametes at all, and you just have mating types. And so yeah, there is that diversity. And it is, as you say, not as simple as just big versus little. Still, I think numerically, that's the closest we have to a universal binary. And off the top of my head, I would say 99.99% of the species do have a clear-cut small gamete versus large gamete distinction. And but I mean, we're biologists. We know there's exceptions to everything. So I just think in the case of in the cases you mentioned, we just acknowledge them. Let it go at that.
I mean, I think that we also have a way out if we want to stick with the gametic definition just by saying these are still males the way that snakes are still tetrapods. you know, because of that descendants and that common ancestry and common history. But as you know, I'm not a big fan of the purely gametic definition of sex anyway, not necessarily for the same reasons that some others have, but just because I think, exceptions notwithstanding, the biology, the sexed biology all throughout the body, genes, chromosomes, genital anatomy, other morphology, hormonal differences, they tend to be so much more of a overlapping spectrum, maybe bimodal, maybe dimorphic, but more continuous in the variation. And this, and I don't want to quibble over all this other than to ask this question: could some of this just really be semantics that we kind of agree on a lot of the variation and its role and its importance, but what we call biological sex, and male and female, might be actually inhibiting our ability to communicate clearly? Is it truly semantic, or do you think there's major conceptual differences in these different, definitions?
No, I agree. It's semantic. It's so we're trying to hash out a vocabulary that'll work for us,
Okay.
and uh, and hopefully we can get there fast because you get the White House with its executive order actually defining male and female on the basis of gametes, and so as you know, I don't think we can go back. And I think the general public believes in a binary, whether we like it or not. And so I think it's a hard sell for us to deconstruct the binary altogether. And so it seems to me the best semantic way forward is to go ahead and allow that the gametes define sex and that everything else is gender, and then we can proceed to subdivide gender into all different categories and get very complex and sophisticated about what gender is in animals as well as in people.
But do you find that the social scientists push back on your attempts to expand gender in these ways?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't had any social scientists um, object to that, and there tends to be approval of evolution's rainbow in social science circles, especially in feminist circles, because it is, after all, contrarian. And um, so a fair number of the sales of evolution's rainbow are in the gender studies courses and so on, where it's introduced as I say, as a contrarian or critical reading.
Yeah. Okay, David, you've had your hand up, waiting patiently for a minute. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask a two-part question, and they both concern sexual conflict. First in the biological world, and then in human cultural diversity. And I think the one thing that is very clear by my lines in terms of the biological literature is very often uh, sexual strategies are conflicting with each other. And you have all these examples of traits that are beneficial for males and not only horrible for females, but horrible for the entire population. Because you get these, hyper aggressive males, and they're just basically they're sexual predators, and the females want none of it, and so it's exploitative, and so evolution doesn't make everything nice. And in the case of sexual behavior, it often results in sexual environments that no human would want to live in. And so the example that's clearest in my own mind is the work on water striders by my own former student Omar Eldikar, in which there's a clear spectrum of male behaviors from docile to hyper-aggressive, and the aggressive males are in any particular group, the aggressive males get the most mating, and then the docile males the advantages at the between group level. So he's worked that out very well. Point is that the aggressive behavior in males is pure and simple disruptive, good for the males and not good for anything else, not good for the females, not good for the population. Still, they're maintained in the population by their within group advantage. And so if I could have you comment on the conflictual nature of a lot of sexual behavior, which of course I think will be reflected in part in sexual diversity, and then I'll pose my second question having to do with cultural diversity.
Well, I don't know, David. You may be right, but a lot of this is dependent on what species you're thinking about. I tend to look at seabirds because as you know, I used to live in Hawaii for a long time, and and the kind of and I wish Darwin had started with seabirds rather than with the peacock, because they're not very dimorphic. They work together. There's a long courtship. You can look at albatrosses, and you can look at penguins, and you can look at a lot of the seabirds. Um, uh, Raise the young together. There's a lot of dynamics. So, for example, you look at albatrosses, the lace-on albatrosses in Hawaii. And so they take a couple years, it seems, of courting one another. And as you say, well, what are they doing while they're talking to one another at great length? And then eventually they do mate, and they mate for a long, long time. And when one of them is at the nest and then the other goes out to get food, the one that gets food comes back, and then they talk a lot. And then the other one goes out, and then they come back. And so, what are they saying to one another in all this time? And so, my conjecture is that they're trying to get on the same page as to what's important, and that they're trying to decide, well, are we worried more about predators? Or are we worried more about finding food? Which is the higher priority for our effort if we're going to raise young together? And which is more important? Where should we go, to the left or should we go to the right? Should we go far shore or near shore? And then when they come back and there's all this interaction, then one of them says to the other, well, this is where I found fish, and this is where I didn't find fish, and so forth. And it seems to me, now that's a conjecture on my part as to what they're saying, but it's otherwise unexplained why there is so much talking back and forth between these. This seems to me like cooperation, manifest cooperation. And if we start from this suite of species, you're not led down the path of, oh my God, they're just beating up on each other. And then when you look into the details of the supposed conflict, it's not often conflict, or it's anthropomorphic to think that it's conflict. I remember there were discussions about male male earthworms or something like that, and male earthworms um, fertilize female earthworms by injecting the sperm into into the body cavity or something like that. And this was supposed to be sexual conflict. But on the other hand, it's not clear that a female is all that bothered. Female earthworm is all that bothered by this. And you certainly don't want, as an earthworm, I would imagine, to be dragging all kinds of genitals around as you're trying to climb through the dirt. And so I just, I'm very suspicious of interpretations of behavior in terms of conflict, because I want to ask, in each such case, did they actually consider the possibility that it wasn't conflict, that it was cooperation of some sort or communication of some sort, and was it really painful? Now, I appreciate the case you have with water striders, but uh, that's where I'm coming from in this, is that I know the predisposition of animal behavior is toward interpreting, toward finding conflict everywhere and interpreting behavior in terms of conflict. And I, I'm so therefore I'm skeptical about a story until it's really teased apart.
Yeah, there's so much to say there. And of course, I wasn't implying it's always conflictual. And so we have magnificent examples of cooperation. And then, of course, nobody knows better than me of how much conflict has been over interpreted in nature and all of that. So let me just proceed to the human part of that. And a wonderful book on this subject is by Robert Paul, an anthropologist. It's titled Mixed Messages, and he's a sociocultural anthropologist who really gets um, evolution. He chaired the Emory University's anthropology department at a time when people like Michael Tomasello and Robert Boyd and Joseph Henrich actually were members of that department. And one thing he says that's very general about human cultures is that they tend to regard biological reproduction as somehow dirty, and as opposed to their culture, their cultural rules. Their cultural rules are exalted, and biological reproduction is represented as somehow dirty. And the reason is, he says, is because in human cultures, sexual competition is such a disruptive force. And if every available woman it was a free for all of the men, for every available woman, there would be chaos. And so many of the rules about marriage and sexual reproduction, if a man dies, then his brother, and all of this kind of stuff, firm, strong rules regulating sexual reproduction, because if you don't, then the culture would be torn apart. That, I think, is what he would say. And I think this lies at the base of so many of our prejudices, basically, and so many of our social constructions of sex and gender, which absolutely are social constructions, and nevertheless they're there for a reason. They've caused the cultures to persist, basically, as long as they have, whatever we think of them in other respects. And so um, I'm channeling him, and I just wondered for a general comment on that part two of my question.
Well, again, I'm not sure about the premise. Having just spent the last month in Polynesia and Tahiti and Easter Island, and of course, I know someone has to do it. So, I've just been there, and the people. I wouldn't describe the culture the way sex is not dirty there, and they make for a very interesting. This is true, in Samoa and throughout Polynesia, where there's not the. So the males live in one group and the females live in another group, and they mate and they raise kids. It just isn't like that. It's not a question of sex being dirty. Sex is quite fluid, as I understand it. Now, I'm not an anthropologist, but you can't help but be impressed that there's not the hang up about sex there. And that's, of course,
Yeah, well, that goes all the way back to Margaret Mead, of course, as I think you were about to say.
Yeah. And so the mutiny on the Bounty and so forth it gets all involved with that, and the men didn't want to get back in the ship and they eventually rebelled and so forth. So,
Right.
And so I had the privilege of landing on Pitcairn Island in spite of the surf. Got a pretty heavy dose of the mutiny on the Bounty last month.
Oh man. So, well, as you say, I mean, if we're biologists, we know all about diversity, so there's no single statement you can make. But in any case, let me pass on to other people.
Okay, I think we're actually out of time. I was asked to keep this to 1 hour. So but I do want to give you the final word, Joan, and and this was a question that was in the chat, and I think it's something we can all leave with. How would you wrap up all of this discussion of animal behavior with regards to sexual interactions, gendered bodies, all this? What does this really tell us about the human experience of sex and gender? How much can we learn from studying animals?
Well, as I mentioned actually in the beginning, so what we learn from this is that diversity in gender and sexuality is natural. Now, the details of what any particular form of diversity does depends on the species and moreover in the habitat that the species in. And it might mean different things in different parts of the species range. But the condemnation of gay and lesbian and trans people always is that it's not natural and that it's some kind of pathology. And that's just not consistent with the biological fact that the diversity is widespread and the commonness of it is high enough that it's not consistent with any kind of disease explanation. And that's what we learn is we learn about the naturalness of the diversity, and then how we deal with that in terms of social policy and so on should then draw on our moral and codes and our religious teachings. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Joan. This has been a wonderful conversation. Joan Roughgarden, Professor Emerita of Biology at Stanford University, also has an appointment at University of Hawaii. We're very honored to have you here. Evolution's Rainbow Revisited. I hope in another 20 years, the number of people who have read your book will have doubled again, and your ideas continue to find audiences and favor among biologists as well. And I appreciate your point that sometimes a prophet is not accepted in his homeland, and I think the field of animal behavior probably needs your message even more than the general public. That's been my experience as well. In talking about these issues. So thanks so much for joining us, Joan. It was great to see you.
Thanks to
And
you, Nathan, also. Thanks for making being
my
such a
pleasure, my
great
pleasure.
host.
And I'm looking forward to all of the essays that are coming out. Joan's is now out, and then I think David, you want to preview that to the group? It's an essay every week or every 2 weeks?
Well, let me see. Eric is here, so maybe Eric can talk about the series.
Yeah, there it is.
Yes, that's right. Joan's article is out now, and we'll have a new article every Tuesday.
Okay, that's awesome. That's
All right.
awesome. So,
And
so great.
thanks for the invitation to do that. I think these are important topics for the general public, scientists as well. So thanks for the great work of Pro Social World.
Yeah, so there's an open invitation for people to suggest content for this view of life, for our podcasts, for our articles, and so I think that we're doing such a great service, I think, with this magazine and podcast and everything we're doing here at Pro Social World. So thank you all. Thank you so much.